This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Nick Qureshi, and in the early hours of Monday the 19th of August, these are our main stories. Ottawa criticises London for stripping an Islamic State fighter of his British citizenship and leaving him with just his Canadian passport. The organisers of the latest protest in Hong Kong say more than 1.5 million people took to the streets despite monsoon rains and warnings from Beijing. And appointees for Sudan's new sovereign council are named. Also in this podcast, how music transforms the lives of disadvantaged children in Chile.
I remember some words from people here against the project saying, "Who cares? Who needs artistic or musical school? We need technicians."
And 100 years after the Weimar Constitution established Germany's first democracy, what are the lessons of its failure for today? First, though, Canada has strongly criticised the British authorities for stripping a Muslim convert of his citizenship because he joined the Islamic State group. Jack Letts is currently being held in prison in northern Syria after he was captured by Kurdish forces 2 years ago. His father is Canadian, which allowed the government in London to withdraw his British citizenship without making him stateless. I asked our correspondent Chris Buckler what the Canadians were saying.
Yeah, if you take a look at this statement, it first of all clarifies and makes clear as far as the Government of Canada is concerned that the UK has revoked Jack Letts' citizenship because, of course, they have not commented on this. So in some ways, we've got the clarification from Ottawa as opposed to London. But you were right in saying that these are strong words. The word they use is disappointed, which sounds a bit like whenever a parent is unhappy with their child. It gives you a sense that they feel that they have been let down by the UK in this. It says terrorism knows no borders, so countries need to work together to keep each other safe. The United Kingdom has, as far as they're concerned, taken unilateral action to offload their responsibilities. And what they're essentially saying here is that this was a problem which Canada had a share in, but this was someone who had come from the UK. He grew up in Oxford. He went to Syria when he was 18 years old. And this is all of a sudden the problem that the UK has said, we're not going to deal with this anymore. It is now up to you, Canada. And they are clearly frustrated by that.
Sounds like the makings of a huge diplomatic row, this.
They're trying to play that down in Ottawa. They're trying to say that they don't engage in diplomacy that is a tit for tat in this kind of circumstances. They want to try and retain a good relationship with the United Kingdom. At the same time, there is no doubt that the frustration comes through in this statement. But Canada also knows that it wants to try and develop relationships with the UK at a time whenever Brexit is coming up, whenever they know that they're going to have to look at some kind of a trading relationship for the future. And Boris Johnson is going to meet the Canadian Prime Minister, his counterpart Justin Trudeau, next weekend coming up at the G7 summit that's been held in France.
And this potentially has huge implications for the other jihadis abroad who now want to come home.
Yeah, there are differences, of course, because the key thing for Jack Letts is he had dual citizenship. So to some extent, the fact that the UK has removed his citizenship is not going to cause him as many problems as others. There are these questions about some individuals who have essentially been left stateless, having no country to call their own because the country that they are a member of has said, we do not want you anymore. And technically that is a big problem because it is, some would argue, illegal. It's not something that a country can do. But in these circumstances, what you might see is people who do have dual citizenship, you might have countries saying, well, if this doesn't have to be our problem, then should we keep it as our problem? And that is, I suppose, part of the worry from the Canadian point of view, that somehow you end up in circumstances where countries try to ship their responsibility onto somebody else rather than trying to deal with it together.
Chris Buckler there. More than 1.5 million people gathered in Hong Kong on Sunday, according to march organisers, as protesters once again took to the streets. Not even heavy monsoon rains could dampen the spirits. The demonstrations, now in their 11th week, were sparked by an extradition bill which has since been suspended by the Hong Kong government but not withdrawn. But concerns remain that the territory's freedoms are being eroded under Chinese rule. Recently, China had accused some of the protesters of terrorist activity, and it's mobilised security forces in nearby Shenzhen. But this Hong Kong protester says they're not giving up.
I think before accusing protesters for anything, try to look at the real problem and how the government turned a blind eye to us and to our demands. This is the real problem, the source of the problem. We are trying to solve the problem, but they are trying to attack us or trying to just turn a blind eye to us.
The protesters were not allowed to march through the city, but the police did allow a demonstration in Victoria Park. Our correspondent Stephen McDonnell was there.
It's very big here in Victoria Park, in fact so big that the street next to me has now also been completely blocked off because nobody else can fit in here. I'm standing in a sea of people. I'm sure you can hear them chanting. And it does mark a shift. I think people are trying to make this a weekend of peaceful protest. And it just shows the determination of the many people in Hong Kong from all walks of life who've been backing this pro-democracy movement to participate when they can, especially when it is peaceful. It just shows how many they can turn out. As I say, the park is completely full. They've been shutting down subway stations nearby, which are becoming very crowded, and still the people keep coming in. Yesterday there was a what we might call pro-Beijing march held. You might hear the rain is just now pouring down, so I've got the umbrella up. That's what you're hearing. And they definitely see this whole movement as a provocative one. They've accused these protesters of worse being terrorists, which is pretty alarming language. It does worry many observers that it could at some point lead to quite a heavy-handed response. Despite the pouring rain, by the way, people are chanting now with their umbrellas up, I guess to try and keep people's spirits high. It's literally bucketing down here. A big tropical storm has just hit. But people in Hong Kong are used to this type of weather, so I don't think it'll stop the rally continuing. It just means that everybody's going to be very wet, including us.
Stephen McDonnell in Hong Kong. On Saturday, thousands of cheering people filled the streets of Sudan's capital, Khartoum, to celebrate a power-sharing deal between the ruling military council and members of the civilian-led opposition. Now the two sides have each nominated their appointees for an 11-person sovereign council, which is designed to guide the North African country through its transition to democracy. Our reporter Sally Nabil is in Khartoum. I asked her who had been selected to sit on the council.
The main opposition bloc has named 5 candidates for the Sovereign Council. They are not very famous names. They are not the stars of the opposition bloc. And perhaps the reason behind that is that those who take part in the transitional period won't be able to run for the elections that will be held in 2022. So perhaps they have decided to keep the big names for a later stage. But they have 5 candidates representing different provinces. So, and on the other hand, we have candidates from the military side, another 5 people. According to local reports, we know that the head of the current military council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, will be part of the Sovereign Council, as well as his deputy, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, known as Hameti. And what's happening now is that both the military council and the opposition bloc will meet tonight to agree on an 11th member.
Yeah, who is General Hameti specifically?
Some people call him the strongest man in Sudan at the moment. He is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group, and they were known before as the Janjaweed, and these groups are notorious for widespread atrocities in the western region of Darfur. And the Rapid Support Forces are mainly blamed for the violent dispersal of the sit-in in the heart of Khartoum back in June the 3rd. So this man is not very much liked here. He's very much feared. And the fact that he will be part of the Sovereign Council to come makes a lot of people worried.
Interestingly, then, what happens to all these paramilitary groups which have been at the centre of so much of the violence in the past?
According to the agreements that have been signed, that these paramilitary groups will come under the umbrella of the Sudanese armed forces. And it's not just the rapid support forces that's the problem. There are a lot of militant groups active in different parts of Sudan. And I think that would be one of the main challenges facing the civilian government that will be formed within the few coming days, because one of the main tasks of this government is to start peace negotiations with various military groups operating in different parts of Sudan.
Sally Nabil for us in Khartoum. The German Historical Museum is marking 100 years since the Weimar Republic was formally established in Germany, the first time the country had been a democracy. It was a thriving experiment, but it ultimately failed and paved the way for the dictatorship of the Nazis. The Weimar exhibition has been curated explicitly to act as a warning that just as Weimar democracy fell apart, so too can today's democracies. Paul Moss reports from Berlin.
You won't find any Nazi flags on show at the German Historical Museum's exhibition. There's not a swastika in sight. But the rise of Nazism is like an invisible presence towards which every display seems to point. Because the real subject here is how vulnerable democracies can be, how quickly Weimar collapsed. The museum's president, Raphael Gross, showed me an item which to him symbolized that collapse, a photograph depicting one of the Republic's early foreign ministers.
We are looking at Walter Rathenau, prominent German Jewish politician. He was one of the big enemies of the extreme right who attacked and murdered him here in Berlin. The murder of Rathenau was a big blow for the democracy of the Weimar Republic.
As I look around this exhibition, one of the things that strikes me is just how flourishing a democracy Weimar was. There's all these posters for the many, many different political parties, but also posters that show the artistic freedom there was, and yet all of that vanished so very quickly.
Yes, and so when we look around as historians today, liberal democracies are attacked all over the world.
Another exhibit shows the degree of sexual freedom which existed under the Weimar Republic. There are copies of gay and lesbian magazines openly published at the time. And remarkably, you can see official permits which authorized those who had one to pursue an unorthodox lifestyle, as Christoph Golasch showed me, a researcher in history at Berlin Technical University.
So what we can find here in this room is a transvestite certificate issued by the Berlin Criminal Police permitting someone called Anna Katter to wear men's clothing. The Berlin police would then refrain from doing harm to them, would refrain from detaining them if they had such a certificate.
What I suppose is striking is how quickly that also fell apart, and then under the Nazis, many homosexuals went to the gas chambers.
That's definitely true. I would say the tolerance was real, but it was maybe only a thin layer that existed during the Weimar Republic.
The Weimar Republic is best known outside Germany for its cultural output, like the music of Kurt Weill with its image of decadence and seediness, an image later cemented by the musical Cabaret, set in Weimar Berlin.
Money makes all the go round the world.
Money problems were extreme under Weimar. Hyperinflation famously led to cash being carried round in wheelbarrows. But it wasn't economics, or indeed the political assassinations, which really did for Weimar democracy. Not according to Christian Odendahl from the think tank the Centre for European Reform. More devastating, he argues, were the attacks on democratic institutions. Two in particular, he says, provide a warning for today.
The attacks on the freedom of the press and the justice system are two which are very important in the Weimar times and which we can see already now in parts of Europe. For example, the justice reforms in Poland, where judges can be more easily replaced by the government. Another example is journalists being afraid to speak truth to power. The slogans, this is a lying press, they are not telling us the truth, or undermining the credibility of the press. I think we're seeing this today, and I think this is very, very worrying.
Some are going to say this is ludicrous to start making comparisons with Weimar. That was a time of extreme economic hardship in the wake of the First World War. There's nothing like that going on at the moment.
I'm not saying we are in Weimar. I'm saying Weimar's destruction started with undermining crucial institutions of democracy. And I think if we see first signs there, we should fight it early, because if you fight it late, it might be too late.
Christian Odendahl ending that report from Paul Moss. Now, Music Life is a brand new podcast from the BBC World Service that takes you into the minds of leading musicians. Every week, a group of musicians get together on a sofa to talk about the creative process and how and why they do what they do. You'll hear stories about how to turn an idea into a song, how you know when a piece of music is finished, and how it feels once it's been released. That's Music Life from the BBC World Service. Just search for BBC Music Live wherever you get your podcasts. In our earlier podcast, we brought you the first reports of a suicide bombing of a wedding party in the Afghan capital, Kabul. More details have now emerged. It's known 63 people were killed, almost 200 injured. The Islamic State group says it carried out the attack in a Shia area of the Afghan capital. This was the reaction of the groom, who together with his bride survived the blast, but saw many of their friends and relatives killed.
I've lost hope. I lost my brother, my friends who came to join my wedding party. The celebration of Independence Day does not matter to me anymore. I don't care whether they are going to light up the city. It's the Independence Night, and it's dedicated only to the rich people who celebrate it. All those killed were labourers and poor people who had attended the ceremony.
Our correspondent in Kabul is Shoaib Sharifi. He told me even war-hardened residents had been stunned by the brutality of this latest bombing.
People were shocked because an attack inside a wedding party was unprecedented and takes the level of violence in Afghanistan to another level, indicating literally you're not safe anywhere. It had a devastating impact on Kabul citizens. In fact, this evening is the eve of the 100th anniversary of the independence of the Afghan independence from the then British. But the city has gone silent, and the Afghan president has cancelled all the celebrations planned for tonight and tomorrow, calling for the nation to join him to mourn and support the family, the loved ones of the victims of this incident.
What wider political reaction has there been? We know the Taliban has condemned the bombing, but the Afghan president saying they have provided a platform for terrorists.
Normally, when this sort of incident happen, there are reactions to the extent. But yes, this time the Afghan government took it slightly more than the usual condemnation, despite Taliban's rejection of any involvement. The Afghan president saying that the culture of this sort of violent attacks was initiated by the Taliban. And if not this one, but we have had some in the past few months where many number of civilians were killed, were claimed by the Taliban. So it is at a time that there was some positive news coming from Doha, Taliban's political office there, and Washington, that both the Taliban and Americans are about to make a final deal with the hope that the last 18 years of conflict will end and we will see some sort of immediate reduction in violence leading to a more permanent ceasefire. But this attack shattered those hopes.
So does this bombing threaten to derail these peace talks?
It may not derail the peace talks. That's why perhaps the Taliban were so immediate condemning it. But somehow it undermines the impact of the outcome of these talks, because people are saying if a deal can bring a reduction into violence, that is most welcome. But if there is a deal and still the country continues to experience such devastating and shocking incidents like this one, that will not be warmly welcomed by ordinary people.
Shoaib Sharifi in Kabul. Gibraltar has rejected a further request from the United States to seize an Iranian oil tanker that had been held since early July on suspicion of transporting oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. The ship has now left port. The government in the British Overseas Territory had said it was unable to comply with an American warrant as it was bound by EU law. The detention of the Grace 1 by British Royal Marines had further raised tensions between Iran, Europe and the US, as our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins reports.
The Gibraltar courts made clear last Thursday that the Iranian tanker was free to go on its way after written Iranian government assurances that its cargo was not being shipped to Syria. That prompted the United States to make a last-ditch legal effort to have the tanker seized on different grounds, that the ship and its cargo of oil was controlled by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. But the government of Gibraltar, a British overseas territory, has now roundly rejected the American case, saying that the Corps is not a designated foreign terrorist organisation in Gibraltar, the UK or in the EU generally, unlike in the United States. More than that, Gibraltar says the American sanctions preventing oil exports from Iran cannot be enforced by the European Union, reflecting what the Gibraltar authorities pointedly call the very different positions and legal regimes in the US and the EU. That's the view not just of Gibraltar, but of the government in London too. So the tanker is free to set sail, and Iran says it is being prepared for departure. All this illustrates vividly the transatlantic tensions over policy towards Iran, even if both Europe and the United States would like to see changes in Iranian behaviour.
James Robbins. Iceland has been marking the impact that climate change is having on a country that owes its very name to the presence of glaciers. Dignitaries gathered on the peak of an old volcano to unveil a commemorative plaque at the site of the Ökyakull glacier, which is now no more than a thin slab of ice. One of those who made the journey was Simony Howe, Professor of Anthropology at Rice University in Texas.
It's the first memorial to a fallen glacier anywhere in the world, and so we really appreciate the symbolism of it, but we also know that political action and concerted action is what needs to happen next. We can't just memorialize things and feel good about it. We need to make big changes in our systems.
Professor Simony Howe. Well, the bronze plaque bears a message to future generations. It reads, "We know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it." Now, we often hear how music can help lift and inspire children from disadvantaged areas. In the Chilean capital, Santiago, young people are being given the chance to learn to play instruments in a school run by members of the folk group Inti Illimani, who became famous in exile during General Pinochet's military rule. Paige Sutherland reports now from Santiago.
Every time Elizabeth Sanchez walks into her school, she is transported to another place, one free of drugs, crime, and violence.
Teniéndolo Inti acá, este colegio se vuelve como tu casa.
This school becomes like your home, and outside there is a world that is not so good because we are poor. You enter here and you feel safe. I felt the warmth, and it's because of the music.
17-year-old Elizabeth has spent her whole life in V.O. Higgins, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Santiago. Colegio Sol de Alemani has given her a chance she never would have had anywhere else, to learn the trombone. Sanchez grew up listening to Inti Illimani with her father. The folk musicians were abroad when the military junta took power in Chile in 1973 and were forced to stay in exile. They toured the world, becoming famous for their songs about social change for the working class. Sanchez's father passed away a few years ago, and listening to their music is how she best remembers him. So when she heard the group was coming to her neighborhood to take over her school, she couldn't believe it.
They are no longer the group that I was going to see in concert. Today they are my teachers, and more than my teachers, they are people that I'm very close to.
Jorge Colon, a leading member of the folk band, takes me into one of his classes. Now 72, he is at the school 2 days a week. It's not the school's mission to produce rock stars, he tells me. But it is to give the children hope.
I think the most important thing is they learn to respect themselves, because they are listening all day, you are garbage, you will finish in jail, and they began to discover that not they can do it. It's a promotion of their own dignity.
I met Mauricio Rojas in the school's courtyard, playing his favorite instrument, the windpipe. Mauricio hated his last school. Now he wakes up every morning at 6 a.m. and travels 2 hours by public transit just to go to school here. He says it's worth it.
Un colegio tradicional se preocupa de formar alumnos que...
I think that a traditional school is concerned with turning out students who are similar to a machine, teaching chemistry, physics, maths and language all day long. Through music and art, this school motivates students and makes them better people. I think that is a big difference.
Colegio Sol del Alemany is quite rare in Chile. Very few public schools offer extensive art subjects alongside the normal curriculum. Mayor Rodolfo Carter gave the go-ahead, but says in the beginning there was a lot of skepticism from his conservative colleagues.
I remember some words from people here against the project saying, who cares? Who needs artistic or musical school? We don't need people singing or playing in the subway station. We need technicians.
But that mindset has changed because of the success of the students. The school has been running for 6 years, and some of them are pursuing careers in music, attending college, and moving out of the neighborhood. Things that once seemed impossible to them.
Paige Sutherland in Santiago. And that's all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. And if you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Nick Qureshi. Until next time, goodbye.